played the game of volleyball for probably about 34 years of my life. And I've played at a fairly high level, played on the national team here in the USA, and then I played professionally in both Austria and Germany. For the last 7 years, I've been doing basically private training where I've focused on arm swing biomechanics. And in that 7-year period, I've done about 13,000 private lessons. And so in that time, I've learned quite a bit. And so I could probably talk for 2 weeks on everything that I've learned, but I've tried to distill down into this talk what I believe is important for us as trainers, coaches, and educators to understand and to be able to apply it to the kids that you train at both the national team level as well as the youth level. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll get started with the presentation. Okay, give me 1 second. All right. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the spike, and we're going to be talking about training it as well as understanding the optimal mechanics of both the approach and the arm swing. So it's very important to understand that both of these movements they coexist with each other. They're extremely important to understand together because without one, you cannot be successful with the other. And so today, the topics are going to be, we are going to be talking about, I should say, the foundations of human movement. So these are the pillars that we should all understand for better understanding of movement, and not just volleyball, but sports in general. The second topic we're going to talk about is anatomy. So a little bit of anatomy and a little bit of physiology. So us as coaches and educators, it's extremely important to understand muscles, bones, joints, how they move, how they produce force, because understanding that will allow you to better understand the movements that you're trying to train, as well as the muscles that are involved. And the third topic we're going to cover are the phases of the spike. So in understanding the approach and the arm swing, the different reference points, what it's supposed to look like, that'll give us information on how to actually properly train it. And when we have that information, when we have a better understanding of it, then we can identify improper mechanics, which is the fourth topic that we're going to cover. And then our final topic is training the actual arm swing. And in that section, I'm going to be talking about the things that I've found success with over the 7 years that I've been doing this and helping to change people's arm swings for the better. And so now we're going to move to the foundations of human movement. So the most important aspect that all of us need to understand is that rotation is the foundation of human movement, not just in sport, but in almost everything that we do, right? So our solar system, we have planets, our planets rotate around the sun, our planets rotate, tires rotate. So how we make sense of the world is actually through rotation. And so when we apply rotation to volleyball or to even other sports, then we can actually understand its impact on those movements. And just to be very clear, rotation is the most effective and efficient way that the human body takes force from the ground and transfers it through the body in order to hit a volleyball hard or to kick a soccer ball. So again, rotation is the foundation of basically all of this. So now we take that foundation of rotation and we apply it to the human body. So in order to actually apply it to the human body, we have to understand that rotation in the body happens in actually phases. And so in the kinetic chain, right, in the kinetic chain in overhead throwing, so in volleyball is an overhead throwing sport. And so the same things that apply to throwing mechanics are also going to apply to volleyball. Now, the kinetic chain simply refers to a specific chain of movements that allow us to produce peak arm velocity. And so just understand that in the human body, when we want to produce the most force with our arm, we have to move in 3 distinct phases. And those phases, as you can see rolling across the screen, are the hip needs to rotate first, as you can see here in this example. The torso needs to rotate second, and then the arm is the third part of that rotation. And so again, in order to transfer force properly all the way up through the ground, through our body, all the way up to our arm, it's a very, very specific sequence. And the reason that that sequence produces peak arm velocity, right, is because power is actually transferred in a very sequential manner, and it utilizes in the human body, one of the most important parts of power generation is eccentric loading. And so you can think of eccentric muscle contraction as muscles lengthening. So when you can think of muscle like rubber bands, when we stretch a rubber band, right, we gain elastic energy. And so what we're doing over time, over the body, is we're doing a series of stretching and contracting and stretching and contracting. So the more we stretch, the more force we can apply throughout the body. So again, the kinetic chain is how we take rotation, we utilize it in the human body, and that's what gives us peak arm velocity, or the most power possible. And so now we have to understand, even though we covered it just now, we have to understand muscle contractions. So the 3 muscle contractions that I want you to be aware of, right, are eccentric, kind of like we just covered. So most of us have done weight training throughout our lives. And so in that example that's scrolling across the screen, when we have weight and we're coming down, right, we're lowering that weight, that is an eccentric muscle action. So the pectoralis major, those big chest muscles, right, that cross the chest and attach to the bones on your arms, they stretch and load, they gain elastic energy. That allows us to produce force, right, to shorten our muscles and to push that weight upwards. Now, the important part to understand is that in an eccentric muscle contraction, if we don't have that stretching going on, we cannot produce enough concentric force. So if you've ever actually done a bench press, but started from here without that eccentric phase, it's very, very difficult to actually push that weight upwards. So those are very, very important to understand. Eccentric is lengthening. Those rubber bands are stretching and loading. And then concentric is shortening. The muscles are shortening to produce movement at a joint. The final contraction that you have to be aware of is the isometric contraction, right? In an isometric contraction, there's no movement from the muscle, but the muscle is working. And so in isometric contractions, the responsibility is actually stabilization. So when we actually isometrically contract, there is no movement at the joint, right? But it's stabilizing that joint rather than producing movement. So those are the 3 muscle contractions that you have to understand, okay? Now we're gonna move on. So like we were talking about earlier, we're going to talk a lot about these eccentric muscle actions, right? Eccentric muscle actions are really what give us stronger concentric muscle contractions, right? They build elastic energy, and that elastic energy is released. So in sports, those actually look like these motions here, right? And this is very important to understand, in that in these sports, in different sports, the same things are going on, right? So let's move back to the kick again. Let's go back to that example. So in the soccer kick, right? Hopefully all of you understand the soccer kick a lot better than Americans do. But in the soccer kick, the first thing that happens is we actually explode our leg backwards, right? The muscles that are responsible for that are concentrically contraction. They're shortening, right? To explode that leg backwards. As that leg explodes backwards, the muscles on the front side of the hip flexors, they stretch and load, right? Those muscles are stretching and loading like rubber bands, and they're building elastic energy. It took me a very, very long time, right? 30-something years to understand that these movements are very, very similar. So in the arm swing, during our external rotation of the shoulder joint, right? The external rotators, the muscles that are on the back of our humerus, our arm bone, those activate, right? They concentrically activate, they shorten to explode my arm back behind me. When that arm explodes behind my body, the muscles attached to the front of that joint, they stretch and load, they eccentrically load, right? That eccentric loading process is extremely important to producing velocity, right? So the internal rotators build elastic energy that allows for a more forceful concentric contraction and a faster arm swing. And then those muscles, my external rotators, right? Those muscles are then going to eccentrically load. They're going to lengthen, right? You can, again, think of that rubber band lengthening to help slow down that moving arm, right? So those muscles are doing multiple things, right? And it's always a stretch and then a shorten, stretch and shorten. So again, don't have to understand exactly what's going on, but understand that muscles move like rubber bands. We build elastic energy, and then we let that elastic energy go. And again, you can see that those movements are very, very similar. Right? In the soccer kick, our hip flexors are loading. In the volleyball swing, our internal rotators are loading. And both of these movements are utilizing the same principles. They're just happening at different joints. Okay. Now we're going to move on. So now we have the stretch shortening cycle, right? So again, in a stretch shortening cycle, a muscle is pre-stretched or pre-loaded before it shortens. So again, you're going to hear this a lot throughout the presentation. In order for us to produce peak arm velocity, we have to use a stretch and a load. And so in a stretch shortening cycle, the reason that we produce faster arm swing or a faster kick is because we store elastic energy in the tendons of our muscles. We also allow more time. So as I explode backwards, right, as that pitcher explodes backwards into external rotation, right, the more time we have through that motion, the more time we have to develop force. And then the final part of that stretch shortening cycle is it initiates something called the stretch reflex within the muscles, right? So within our muscles, deep within our muscles, we have sensors, and there's something called muscle spindles. When a muscle spindle is stimulated because of a very forceful stretch, that sends a signal to our spinal cord, and that signal goes right back to the muscle. So instead of going to the spinal cord, up to the brain, back down the spinal cord, and back out to the muscle, it happens in an instant. And the reason that it happens so quickly is because it's meant to protect our joint. It's meant to protect our body, which is why it is such a violent action. And it's been hypothesized that when we actually utilize a stretch reflex, we actually gain more motor units, or our body grabs onto the motor units because we're trying to protect our shoulder joint. So really, in essence, when we're doing an arm swing, we're trying to dislocate our shoulder as fast as possible. The body senses a threat, right? It senses the arm is being stretched too far, and then it rapidly contracts. And that's a much, much faster contraction than us consciously trying to force our arm forward, okay? And so the final pillar of human movement, again, is counter motions, right? So in a counter motion, body segments, right? Usually it's neighboring body segments are moving in opposite directions. Anytime we have body segments moving in opposite directions, we have a stretch that happens, right? Give me 1 second. Let's ask these guys to mute themselves. All right. So going back to the counter motions, right? Again, anytime body segments are moving in opposite directions, what do we get? We get stretching going on, right? And so as we're looking at these examples across the screen, you can see, again, our body moves forward, a limb moves backwards, right, in the soccer kick. And what that allows, right, is that eccentric loading to take place, right? That eccentric loading is vital for power, right? And so again, if we're going back over it, the foundations of human movement, we have rotation, right, which we know is the most effective and efficient way to produce force. And then we have the kinetic chain, right? The kinetic chain is how we utilize rotation. And the kinetic chain is used in 3 phases, right? So understand that the pelvis or the hips rotate first, torso rotates second, and the arm is the last thing to rotate through.
Isaac, I'm sorry for disturbing.
No problem.
But please, everyone, check your microphones, because some people have left them on, and it's really it disturbs us. So please, everyone, check. Okay, thank you.
Good. You want to move on, or we want to give them a chance a little bit?
Seems like one didn't hear me. Okay, but I hope maybe you can give you can give Amanda the right to do that, to mute everyone. Amanda Bush. So we don't run in this problem again.
That's okay. Sometimes it happens on these Zoom calls.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Okay. So anyway, finishing up the foundations in human movement, we have our muscle contractions, right? We have eccentric. Again, eccentric is going to be talked about a lot throughout the talk. Eccentric is lengthening, concentric is shortening, isometric, there's no movement, right, is stabilization. The greater eccentric loading we have, the greater concentric force. And then we all have the stretch shortening cycle. Just remember that we store elastic energy, we increase range of motion, which increases the amount of time for force development. And then we also utilize the stretch reflex. And finally, we have counter motions, right? Anytime we have body parts moving in opposite directions, we get to utilize our stretch shortening cycle, right? That eccentric loading of musculature. All right, so now we're going to go over some anatomy. So again, all of us coaches and educators, we just have to have a little bit of working knowledge of anatomy that gives us an idea of the muscles that are responsible for movements in a joint, which is very, very important. Right, hold on one second here. I'm going to try to get these guys to mute. Give me 1 second. Let's see here. Seems like that worked. Amanda, if you're listening, let me know if that worked for you.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay. All right. Let's go back to it. All right. So moving on, we're going to talk about some anatomy now. And again, this anatomy is important in the sense that this is the anatomy for the overhead throwing motion or the spike. So the first muscle that we're going to be talking about, right, is the gluteus maximus. This muscle is located on the back of the hip. It's one of the most important muscles of the lower half of the body, and it's one of the most powerful. And so the job of the gluteus maximus is to extend and externally rotate the hip joint. So during the swing, when the gluteus maximus, if you're right-handed, right, the right gluteus maximus should contract in order for the pelvis to actually rotate forward to a closed position. And so again, the job of the gluteus maximus is to rotate that pelvis forward. And going back to our kinetic chain, right? Remember that first part of rotation of the kinetic chain is our hip rotation, right? So the gluteus maximus is the muscle that's responsible for the first phase of the kinetic chain, okay? All right, moving on. Again, rotates the pelvis forward during the motion. That's that first stage of the kinetic chain. And so moving up the chain of movement from that first phase, right, from the gluteus maximus, are the obliques. So the obliques, we have two sets. We have both internal and external obliques. And the external obliques, or the obliques in general, they rotate and laterally tilt the torso. The obliques are the power source of the human body. So those are the muscles, especially during training, that you really want to isolate because this is the real engine of the human body, the main power source. So as the torso rotates forward, that is the second stage of the kinetic chain. So again, our glutes have rotated the pelvis forward. The torso is remaining open. Now, as we rotate or as we activate those obliques, the torso then rotates forward. That's stage 2 of the kinetic chain. So again, we're taking that force off of the ground and we're moving it through the body in a rotational manner. And again, because it's our power source, the faster we move our torso, the faster our arm is going to move. So those two motions are tied together. And that's why it's so important to have very, very strong and powerful obliques. And so now we're going to move from muscles to bones. And we're only going to talk about the shoulder joint, right? The glenohumeral joint. These two bones, right? The scapula, which is the shoulder blade, and the humerus, which is our big arm bone, right? Those two bones articulate together, right? That's something called the glenoid cavity, and you can see it here, right? So these bones articulate together, and that arm bone, right, our big humerus, rotates within that cavity, okay? It's the most mobile joint in the body, and it's a ball and socket joint. And so the reason that we have or can have a lot of problems with that joint is because of the amount of motion that it gives us. And so sometimes with motion also comes the ability to get injured more easily. And so that's why all of the musculature that surrounds your shoulder joint needs to be strengthened to a high level to withstand all of the forces that are placed on it. And so now we're going to go through some of those muscles on the actual scapula. So first we have the teres minor, the infraspinatus, and the supraspinatus. So these are our external rotators. These muscles, as you can see here, right, they're attached to the scapula or the shoulder blade. And most importantly, they're attached to the back of that arm bone, the back of the humerus, right? And that attachment is important because their job is to externally rotate the shoulder joint. So again, when you're looking at this example, when you see his forearm rotating back behind his head, right? Those are his external rotators concentrically contracting. Those muscles are shortening to produce movement at the shoulder joint, right? Very, very critical to shoulder motion, right? And so the external rotators are responsible for externally rotating that arm backwards, right? And then going back to our kinetic chain, this would be considered the third stage of it, right? So we've had the glutes, we've closed the pelvis, our obliques, we've rotated the torso forward, and now our arm is lagging behind our trunk. It's the third part, the third phase or segment of the body that's now rotating behind us and about to explode forward. The external rotators are also responsible for decelerating, right, the shoulder joint. And because you saw those muscles are not very big, those muscles take a high level of force, right? And so it's really important that those muscles are very, very strong, right? So in strength training, you have to isolate these muscles because again, they take a high level of force during deceleration. And now we have our internal rotators, right? So we have the subscapularis that sits on the underside of the scapula. We have the pectoralis major, that big chest muscle. And then we have that latissimus dorsi, right? Our big lat muscle, one of the biggest in the body. So these three muscles, right, they attach to the front of my arm, right? And again, the attachment site is very important because they attach to the front of my humerus, right? Their job is to internally rotate, right? To explode my arm backwards into internal rotation, right? So those internal rotators, right, are eccentrically loading during external rotation, right? They're gaining elastic energy. And then during acceleration, they concentrically contract very, very quickly and explode the arm towards the volleyball, which is very, very important, right? And so you can imagine those muscles need to be extremely powerful, extremely strong if we want to produce a lot of force. And the final muscle that we're going to cover, and try to remember this, we are isolating some of these muscles. It would take a long time to cover every single muscle around the shoulder joint. These are just some of the most important ones. So the last one is the rhomboid. Okay, so the rhomboid attaches, as you can see here in this example, it attaches to the side of the scapula and it also attaches to the vertebrae. And the job of the rhomboid is to retract the scapula. So when you squeeze your shoulder blades together, that's retraction. When the shoulder blades open back up, that's called protraction. So we utilize the rhomboid first. We pinch, right? We activate, it shortens. And then we isometrically contract, right? It's active, but there's no more movement. And the rhomboid stabilizes the shoulder joint. So all of you that are training at young levels, right, the youth level, if your kids don't feel a pinch that's happening behind their hitting shoulder, most likely they're not utilizing this muscle. This muscle is essential, very, very essential at stabilizing and keeping the shoulder joint safe and healthy throughout these movements. So it's extremely important that you understand the motion of it, right? Its responsibility and what it does. And so the rhomboid also assists with deceleration. So again, it was before retracted. As it protracts, right, as it wraps around your thorax, right, it's also helping to slow that highly moving arm, slowing it down, right? And so again, during deceleration, the rhomboid is eccentrically loading. So it's lengthening, just like a rubber band, helping to slow that arm down. And again, going back to what we were talking about, right? The inability to achieve the fully retracted position, right? To pull that scapula back towards your spine. If you cannot do that during the throwing or overhead motion, right? That's what we're talking about, our spike. If you don't activate that muscle, if you can't get it retracted, it will put a lot of stress and strain on the anterior structures of the shoulder, right? A lot of stress there. And so for those of you that have players with shoulder problems, especially on the front side, a lot of that is actually a result of poor scapula movement. So again, during training, during weight training, during hitting, we're really trying to pinch, right, or activate that rhomboid as my arm is going into external rotation. Very, very important to understand. So again, in summary, we have our glutes, right? Give me a sec, we're going to mute these people real quick. All right, so we have the glutes. The glutes rotate the pelvis forward, right? And that's the first stage of the kinetic chain. So when the glute activates, right, if you're a right-handed hitter, your right gluteus maximus activates to rotate the pelvis forward, right? First stage of the kinetic chain. And then we move up, right? We have the obliques. The obliques explode. They cause our torso to rotate forward. Again, that's the primary power source. That's stage 2 of the kinetic chain. Then we have our scapula and our humerus, right? Those two bones that form the glenohumeral joint, right? Then we move on to our external rotators. Those muscles are responsible for externally rotating the arm. That's the third stage of the kinetic chain. So again, we're going to keep hearing the same terms: rotation, rotation, rotation. Hips, torso, shoulder, right? Those three have now rotated. And remember that the external rotators also help with deceleration or decelerating the arm. Then we have our internal rotators. The internal rotators are our accelerators, right? They accelerate, they internally rotate the arm forward. Very important to make sure that those muscles are strong, right? Again, something to work on during weight training. And then finally, we have that rhomboid. The rhomboid retracts the scapula, stabilizes the shoulder joint, and assists with decelerating that moving arm, okay? And now we're gonna go into our spike sequence. So we've understood the foundations of human movement. We understand the muscles that are responsible for the actual movement that's going on. And now we're going to look at all of that movement and put it into the actual spike sequence. And again, we're talking about the approach and then the arm swing. So the primary movements that make up the spike, right? There's two of them. It's the counter movement jump and the overhead throw. So these two movements combine to form the spike. And so you can see it here, right? During that approach, we do a counter movement jump and then followed by the overhead throwing motion. And you can see how similar, right, these motions are, right? Which is why it's so key, right, that we understand that all of these motions in sport are very, very similar, right? The body is sequenced very similarly, right? As you can see here, the pitcher, pelvis is closed, my pelvis is closed, torso is open, right? So we have eccentric loading going on in the torso. Torso closes down, arm lags behind us, right? So all of these motions, extremely similar, okay? So now we're going to move on to the approach, right? The approach sets the foundation, right, for our timing, our vertical leap, and our power. So like we were talking about before, we cannot talk about arm swing mechanics without actually understanding how important the approach is, right? So some of the key reference points in the approach. Now, these last two steps that you see here, right? These last two steps that he's taking, okay? Those two steps, right? They're collectively called the step close. Some people call it the penultimate step, right? These two steps are really the most important and vital through the approach. The first two steps, right? If we go back, these two steps, they're just getting you moving. The last two, these need to be as explosive as possible. So going back to those pillars that we talked about in the beginning, right? We talked about counter motions, right? So in the approach, our first counter motion occurs during this step close. So as you can see, as his arms are exploding into hyperextension, his foot or his leg is going into flexion, right? His torso, right, is also going into flexion, right? And when we have torso flexing forward and arms extending upwards, we get a stretch, right? And so that's the first counter motion of the actual spike sequence, okay? Now, this is a very important reference point here, right? Arms should be at peak hyperextension, right? That's what it's called, right? Arms are peaking at hyperextension at heel contact. So in a four-step approach, when that third step is hitting the ground, as that heel is hitting the ground, the arms should be at their peak, torso should be flexed forward, right? If this reference point is not there, right? So if the arms are actually coming down as that heel is hitting, we know that there's going to be improper synchronization and a loss of force in our double arm lift. So we're not going to get maximum lift out of our jump, okay? Very important. A couple of other key reference points. Arms should be fully extended at least up until parallel to the ground. And the reason for that is, again, we want to use as much range of motion to produce force and momentum. The more we can get our arms to move, the more they will assist us with takeoff, right? And as we talked about earlier, the greater the torso flexes forward to a certain extent, the greater the arms get into hyperextension. Hyperextension allows us more time to develop force. Okay. So in the 7 years that I've been teaching mechanics, of the 13,000 lessons that I've done, even though a lot of people come and see me for arm swing mechanics, if they cannot synchronize their step close and their approach properly, they will not be able to swing. I want you to understand how important that is. So in volleyball, especially when we're spiking, time is everything. So if I'm not explosive during my step close, if it takes too long for my arms to rise, that will limit the amount of time that I have to go through proper arm swing mechanics. So it's very, very critical that you train your players to properly do this motion, because it will affect their ability to do proper arm swing mechanics. And finally, foot position is highly individual, as you can see in these examples, right? Some people like to turn their feet. Some people turn one, the other stays open. One of the things that we try to get our players to do is to at least have those feet shoulder width apart at takeoff, which is important, right? Because we want to engage both legs, and we want to turn those feet if possible. Again, these are encouraging things that we do to our players. We have their feet turned to 45 degrees. What I've found in the time that I've been doing this is if you turn the feet to almost 90 degrees, if you fully turn to the setter during takeoff, most players, most athletes have a very hard time actually rotating the pelvis closed during that first phase of the kinetic chain. So again, the takeaway of this should be shoulder width apart, feet at 45 degrees, and those legs should hit almost simultaneously, as fast as you possibly can. We're trying to put as much force downward, right? And according to Newton's law, right, as much force as we put downward, that force is going to be pushed back on us, right? And we're going to use that force to lift off of the ground. And the final thing is the heels should align. So again, this is what we try to get our players to do. Sometimes, again, there's individual variation, but we want to try to align the heels of the feet. We don't want to have the feet in a staggered position at the jump, because that can affect our rotational motion as we leave the ground. So now we're going into our takeoff and the early arm cocking phase, right? So as you can see in this example, Owen here has some of the best mechanics that you'll see. And as you see his arm, it's I shouldn't say rotating, pulling, right? It's called horizontal abduction. It's pulling across his body. If we think of the arm as weight, right? Weight is going to have an effect on the torso. So if we pull it horizontally, right, it's allowing that torso to actually rotate to an open position, right? Now the guide arm, right, as you see that left arm rising, most guide arms will go straight up. Again, lots of individual variation there. And universally, you will see that guide arm pull into the body, right, before he swings. The reason that guide arm comes into the body, it comes tight, is because it increases our rotational velocity, which also increases our arm velocity, okay? So this is also where the first stage of the kinetic chain, right? We talked about that earlier, right? That rotational sequence, stage one begins now, right? So the pelvis rotates forward, torso is rotating backwards. So this is really important to understand. We have oppositional rotation that's happening. So basically what we're doing in the human body is we're coiling ourselves, we're twisting ourselves up, we're gaining eccentric or elastic energy, right? We talked about that in our muscle contractions. As that torso opens up, our obliques, right, the muscles of the torso, stretching and loading, gaining elastic energy, allowing us to produce more force. And that's also our second counter movement, right? So the hips are rotating forward, torso rotates back. Again, that's a counter motion. That's going to cause a stretch or an eccentric load, okay? Now, one of the other aspects of the arm cocking phase that's extremely important, right, is to understand that right as the arm is about to go into external rotation, the elbow, right, should be positioned level with our shoulder joint, right? And the way that it gets positioned properly is scapula retraction, right? The rhomboid contracts to squeeze the scapula towards the spine. That's what helps to position our arm properly before the arm rotates externally, which is extremely important to stabilize the shoulder joint. And again, in the arm cocking phase, it's extremely individual. There's not one way to do it. So even at the professional level, you'll see some variation. You will see a lot of lower pulls, right? As you can see, some of the best players out there, but very, very individual. And so the only time as a coach or a trainer that you want to interfere with someone's mechanics is if it's going to cause injury or if they're not producing the amount of force that they possibly can. Otherwise, you want to work with their individual mechanics to produce the most force possible. And again, ideally, as you draw that arm back, the arm is in an internally rotated position. The reason that the arm wants to be in an internally rotated position is because I can get more speed or more momentum into external rotation. The faster I rotate my shoulder joint, the faster I get a stretch across my internal rotators, and the more force I actually produce. So again, in the arm cocking phase, sometimes we have a circular motion. That's how it's been characterized, right? With some of the higher level players. We have bow and arrow. Right? That's a kind of a good visual for a lot of us. At least in America, that visual of bow and arrow has been around since I've been a kid. And again, many, many variations of it. And again, the universal principles of this, right, is it pulls across the body, whether it's low, whether it's high, helps to open up the torso and prepare us for torso rotation. And going back to our torso rotation, our torso loading, it's something called hip and shoulder separation. So again, go back to the kinetic chain. As our hips rotate forward and the torso rotates backwards, right? We're separating those two joints, right? We're oppositionally rotating the body, and that's what gives us that eccentric load across the body. The greater that load, the more we lengthen that, the greater the amount of force we can provide. So again, during training, you're trying to get your players to rotate their torso back while they're rotating their pelvis forward to produce the most force possible. And now we move to the late arm cocking phase. And so this is characterized by maximum external rotation, right? So the external rotators are exploding the arm backwards, and that eccentrically loads our internal rotators, the muscles that are attached to the front of my humerus. So again, as we're looking at these examples, right, as the torso is rotating forward, the arm is rotating behind the body. So again, the reason that we have so many of these visuals is when you're a coach and you're using video, which is very important, you can see if all of these reference points are actually happening. If you don't see these reference points occurring, then you know there are breakdowns in their actual mechanics. And that's when you can actually start the process of training, changing, and repatterning those mechanics, okay? So this is also the third stage of the kinetic chain. So hips have gone through, torso has gone through, and now the arm is rotating. So all of that energy is now gone through the entire body. It's starting to load in the internal rotators, right? And it is the most important aspect of power transfer. This is actually where a lot of breakdowns occur for most people. Okay, they actually don't allow their internal rotators to build or stretch and gain elastic energy. What a lot of people do during this phase is they tend to push their arm forward. They tend to force it forward. And that's something that will break down the actual velocity of the arm swing. And again, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And during this phase, the rhomboid, right? We've talked about that rhomboid in the beginning. This is when the rhomboid is isometrically contracting, right? It's holding in place to stabilize your shoulder joint. It's retracting, right? And that's what's stabilizing your shoulder joint during this very, very violent movement, okay? And that's very, very important. I'm going to keep coming back to rhomboid activation, scapula retraction, okay? And as you see, it's very similar to other sports, right? So in late arm cocking and the swing, very similar to our late arm or late leg cocking in the soccer kick, right? Very, very similar. And finally, we have acceleration, right? The internal rotators that have built all of this tension, all of this elastic energy, now get to release, right? And again, that happens automatically, right? Because those muscles have gained a ton of elastic energy, those rubber bands have stretched, arm swing will, or the arm will explode forward with a ton of force. And then the elbow extends to ball contact, right? So everything that we do, all of this rotation, funny enough, is meant for one purpose, right? Is meant to extend the elbow as fast as humanly possible, okay? Then we have deceleration, right? This is after the swing has occurred, after ball contact, the external rotators, as we were talking about before, right? They contract eccentrically. So after contact, right? After I've contacted the ball, my arm is still moving, right? It needs to be slowed down. The external rotators, the muscles on the back of my arm, are lengthening now, right? To slow this down. Now, one of the nice things in the arm swing is when we hit a volleyball, right? The ball hits back on us, right? Equal and opposite force. So the ball actually helps to decelerate our shoulder, right? As well as our external rotators and our rhomboid. High forces placed back there, right? And so we want to give the arm as much time to slow down as possible. So encourage, right? When you're training your players, want to encourage follow through, right? We don't want to encourage them to stop. If you encourage them to stop, puts a lot of force on the external rotators, greater chance for injury. And as we were saying, this is the most common injury phase because there is a lot of pressure, a lot of force placed on the external rotators here. And finally, the last part of the sequence of spike is our landing, right? So we want to encourage two-legged landing, right? Because that allows us to dissipate all of the forces onto two legs. And as we're landing, our muscles are actually stretching, right? To slow us down, right? To dampen all of the forces that we've created. This is also the time for the most injury-prone phase, right? And girls, those of you who are coaching girls, they are 4 to 6 times more likely to get a non-contact ACL injury, right? One of those ligaments of the knee. So it's encouraged to land on two legs, as well as make sure that we're actually bending the knees quite a bit. So we're allowing our muscles more time to slow us down. It's very similar to the deceleration of the shoulder. All right. So again, in that spike sequence, you have the approach, our key reference points, right? Max hyperextension with the arms during heel contact of the third step. Should be done as explosively as possible. Feet should be at 45 degrees. Heels are aligned, okay? Lots of individual variation, right? And that's okay. And again, with the torso, the more flexion the torso goes through, the more hyperextension in the arms, which will give you more time to develop force in your counter movement jump. Take off and early arm cocking, lots of individual variation. Again, the universal principle should be that the arm draws horizontally across the body, right? Allows the torso to open up. And during this phase, the pelvis or the hips are closing as that torso is rotating upwards. It's the first phase of the kinetic chain. And then we have our late arm cocking phase. So that's when our torso rapidly rotates forward and our arm rapidly rotates backwards, right? We have that oppositional rotation, stage 2 of the kinetic chain, right? And so that's when the rhomboid highly activates, stabilizes the shoulder joint, retracts back to your spine, right? And protects the shoulder joint. Internal rotators are building elastic energy. Then we have acceleration. Those internal rotators concentrically contract, right? They rapidly rotate the arm forward. And then deceleration. This is one of the most common areas for injury, right? The external rotators are slowing the arm down, okay? Give me 1 second here. Let me admit these guys back in. Give me 1 second. Oh, there we go. All right. And then we have our landing, right? Most force on the lower extremities. We want to encourage two-legged landing, okay? And so the reason why two-legged landing wouldn't occur is usually because there's not a lot of rotation happening in the body. There's no kinetic chain. So there's more flexion and extension of the torso, which causes the leg to rise. So for all of you coaches that are looking at your outside hitters that are right-handed, I can almost guarantee you that probably 3/4 of them, 75%, land on their left leg, right? And so again, that's something that you want to make sure that is not occurring and you want to train. So now we're going to go over it, right? We're going to go over it in this video here. We're going to go over all of those reference points now. Okay, so first reference point, right? We're loading on that left leg. This is our big step close, right? Arms are heading back into peak hyperextension. Torso is flexing forward, allowing more range of motion at heel contact, right? Very, very important. This is one of the most important reference points in the approach, okay? This is also our first counter motion. Arms are going up, torso is going down, okay? And we go through full range. Arms are fully locked, going through full range up until parallel with those arms. Feet are 45 degrees, heels are aligned, feet are shoulder width apart, okay? And we go into our first phase, right? Our first stage, early arm cocking. So as you can see, it's more of a circular motion, right? Circular arm cocking phase. His hips, right? His pelvis, lower half is rotating closed, right? Notice his hips are actually rotating towards the neck. Torso is rotating open, right? To an open position, right? That's stage 1 of the kinetic chain, right? Hips close, stage 1, okay? Stage 2 of the kinetic chain, right? Obliques activate to rapidly rotate the torso forward, right? That's your stage 2 of the kinetic chain. And then another counter motion, right? So the torso rotates forward, arm rotates backwards. Again, very important reference point here. So when you're filming at practice, when you want to change mechanics, you have to notice, is the forearm, right? Is the forearm back behind the head during external rotation, all right? So external rotators, exploding the arm backwards. Internal rotators are gaining elastic energy, right? They're building force. Torso rapidly rotates and explodes forward, right? That's acceleration. After ball contact, deceleration. External rotators, right? The muscles on the back of your bone, back of the humerus, eccentrically contract to slow the arm down, right? And again, we want to give them time. So you can see Owen here is allowing them a lot of time to slow down. Right? He has that follow through. And then finally on landing, pretty decent landing, kind of 1-2 landing there. Pretty good. So those are all the phases of the spike, okay? Again, I know it's a lot of info, pretty fast, but again, as you get better at going through this kind of chain of movement, right? Identifying these reference points, right? Especially this one, hip is forward, torso's open, hip and shoulder separation, right? Elbows back, positioned level with the shoulder joint, right? Torso is going to rapidly rotate to produce that arm speed. Remember, quicker torso, right, is faster arm velocity, right? We want to rotate, rotate, rotate. All right. So now hopefully we have a better hold of what proper mechanics look like, right? We have our pillars of human movement. We know how muscles work. We know which muscles are doing what. We now understand the different phases of the swing, and that's going to allow us to now identify improper mechanics. So all of you coaches that are working with youth, this is a really good chance for you to see probably a lot of things that you're seeing right now, okay? We're going to go through it. So during the approach, right? I'm sure all of you see this a lot. Right? Arms are starting way too high here, okay? So when the arms start this high, this will impact the synchronization of the torso and the arms, right? In this actual sequence, we should have the arms just hanging straight down, okay? So the arms are too high here. Now, if we watch her go into her step close, right? We notice that her arms are actually coming down too soon, right? Before heel contact. Right? So as she's coming down, right? When her heel is contacting the ground, her arms are already coming down. So again, body is not synchronized properly here. And then we have a very small or weak step close, right? Her third step, this is supposed to be the largest and most powerful. This is where you're gaining most of the energy for the swing. As you can see here, it's very small, very slight, right? We're not creating a lot of force. Her torso, right? Very little torso flexion, right? That's not going to allow her arms to go back into hyperextension. Okay, so her torso is high, too high. Right? Arms aren't fully extended, right, through the motion. As you can see, she's already breaking. And so she is trying to start her arm cocking phase before she's left the ground, right? She has not gone through a full counter movement jump yet, okay? You can also see that her last step, right, is too big, right? This does not allow us to produce a lot of force, right, properly. You want to use both legs. Remember, we said shoulder width apart allows us to produce the most force there, okay? So a lot happening there, a lot going wrong. So here's an idea of incorrect versus correct, right? So again, that first phase, arms should be down. As you can see, huge third step on the right, right? Versus a small third step on the left. Arms at peak hyperextension on the right. Arms are pretty low, maybe parallel to the ground on the left side, right? Torso is flexing forward on the right side, allowing her to gain more hyperextension, right? And again, you can see, right, Julia on the right side, right, in that proper form, is going through a full double arm lift, full counter movement jump. Feet are shoulder width apart, right? There's not a big step there. It's very, very clear, right? Incorrect versus correct, okay? So again, I cannot tell you, right, in the time that I've been doing this, the synchronization, right? The speed and the synchronization, excuse me, of the arms, torso, and legs, right? During this whole motion is critical to the success of the swing itself. So again, for you youth coaches, you need to spend a lot of time getting that step close, right? And the approach correct, right? Very, very important. So now as we go into takeoff and early arm cocking, right? Remember how we talked about before, where should that arm be moving? It should be moving horizontally, right? That elbow should be moving backwards, right? To allow the torso to open up. Now you can see in this example, instead of her actually cocking back her arm, right? There is no arm cocking phase. It's going right over her head, right? And this is very, very common for athletes that have not learned the overhead throwing motion, right? This is something that we want to avoid because we are not allowing the torso to gain elastic energy, right? Really important here. And again, I can almost guarantee that those of you who are training young kids, right, you're facing a lot of this. And then late arm cocking, right? In this example, right, we're going to take a look here. You can see that his elbow is not positioned properly, right? So even in early arm cocking, it's incorrect, right? This elbow is way too high. And now, remember, as we talked about earlier, what causes a high elbow, right? No retraction. So if I retract my scapula properly, right, what happens to my elbow? It actually gets positioned, right, level with my shoulder. So in this example, no scapular retraction, right? And that's why the elbow is so high. Shoulder joint is not stabilized, right? Putting himself in a chance for injury. And as I was training this guy, he's very new to volleyball. He's only played for maybe a year. And so we're trying to build better mechanics, right? Luckily, in this example, there is no flexion of the torso, right? But that's another common one that you'll see. And then again, we talked about the kinetic chain, right? Rotation of the pelvis, followed by rotation of the torso, followed by rotation of the arm. So if we look, right, you see that his torso is not open, right? He's not sequenced properly, right? So his hip and his torso are kind of static, right? They're not moving very well. There's not a ton of rotation happening there. And that's going to affect power, okay? Now, during acceleration, now this is one of the more important points of maybe this whole talk, right? In order to gain peak velocity in the arm, remember what we've talked about all throughout the day. We are trying to gain elastic energy, which will automatically explode my arm forward, right? Effortlessly. In this example here, what this player is doing is he is forcing his arm forward. When you force your arm forward, again, it puts a lot of stress on the shoulder joint and you will actually lose velocity, right? This impacts the amount of velocity that you have. So in proper acceleration, right, the arm should be way back into external rotation, right? The internal rotators need to be building more elastic energy. Here's another example on the ground. And again, for those of you that are training youth, being able to see this, right, identify it, immediately tells you that there is improper mechanics going on, right? They are not maximizing themselves. So you can see, right, In the example on the left, right, you can see there's no external rotation. The forearm is not behind his head. The example on the right, you can see how far that arm is lagging behind him, right? And that's what you want to see, because you know that the muscles that cross that joint, the internal rotators, are building elastic energy, right? Very important. Here's another example. Again, all people that I've trained identified improper mechanics, right? And had to go through change, right? And that's what you can see. So again, I can almost guarantee that probably about maybe 15 to 20% of the people that all of you are training will come across some of this. So being able to identify it, very, very important. So again, if on the left side, you see that arm being forced forward, right? You know that the internal rotators have not been given the chance to build energy. The torso has not been rotated properly here, okay? And then finally, an acceleration, right? You can see, right, for those of you that know soccer very well, these two things are very, very different, right? See how much more range of motion I'm gaining in my relaxed state, right? Versus my toe poke on that right side, right? So these are the equivalent, right? Even though they're different sports, our limbs are moving very similarly. And then deceleration, right? I think this video has been viewed, I don't know, maybe hundreds, if not thousands of times, right? Please, 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 please do not do this. Do not do this with your players, right? Now, why would this be dangerous for the shoulder joint? Now, remember, high forces are placed on the external rotators. Those muscles are not very big, right? And they're slowing down one of the fastest moving limbs in sport, okay? So if you stop your arm, you're putting a lot of force on the external rotators. Remember, more time is much, much better, right, for your shoulder joint than stopping the arm, okay? And finally, landing, right? Oftentimes you'll see that right there, right? One-legged landings, okay? And again, this usually occurs as a result of a piking action, right? A flexion action of the torso rather than rotation. When the torso flexes forward, that often causes the right leg to rise with right-handed hitters. And again, after playing this game for about 30 years of my life and not knowing what I know now, right? I wish I would have spent a lot more time training myself to actually land on two legs. So again, the way in which you train people to land on two legs is you get them to think of jumping much more rotationally. It's that rotational action that helps to actually get a player to land on both legs. Very, very important. So again, we'll go through this quickly. Again, poor arm synchronization in the approach, weaker small step close, torso not flexed forward. Takeoff and early arm cocking, right? As we saw in the example before, arm cocking begins too soon, right? You got to go through your full counter movement jump. Torso remains upright, right? It's not, I'm sorry, torso remains closed, right? It's not open, right? During that arm cocking phase, and the arm is not moving across the body. It's going right over the head. Torso remains closed, not open. Late arm cocking, right? Poor sequencing, right? There's no hip, torso, arm, right? There might be a piking or a flexion happening, and engaging from the shoulder joint. So you're actually trying to create force at the shoulder joint versus the entire body. We have acceleration, as we said, forcing that arm forward. Deceleration, again, please don't stop the arm. Try not to train your kids to do that. Allow that arm to have time to slow down. And finally, our landing, encourage two-legged landings so that forces are dissipated on both legs. And finally, we get to our training, right? At the national team level, video is one of the most important things, and not just at the national team level, but all levels, right? This gives us a chance to actually see, right, the motions that are involved, right, the positions of our limbs. And if we can actually identify, right, now that we have the ability, hopefully the ability to do that, right, we can see where critical breakdowns occur, right? And so when you're filming should be done perpendicular, as you see in this example here, because this allows you to see all of the reference points, and it allows you to see the position of the limbs relative to the torso, right? So this is always the best view. And again, we're going to analyze our reference points, identify deficiencies, as you can see here, right? So in this example, right, you can see that there is not a lot of retraction happening, right, on that left side, right? You don't see that elbow very far back into the frame of the camera, right? Very different it looks here. As you can see, when he goes back into external rotation, right, a lot more range of motion he gains, okay? So these are the things that as coaches you're going to be looking for, right? And the best, one of the most powerful tools is video, okay? And then you're going to use progressions, right, to try and train these motions. We'll talk about that in a second. So when you're trying to make changes as an athlete and a coach, athletes need to see themselves on film. If they don't see themselves, right, doing the motion and trying to make change, it's almost impossible. And again, it just goes back to the importance of video. And you can see in this example, right, not a lot of arm cocking phase going on, right, in that left side. Elbow is not very far back, torso is not open, right? Go back to his arm, his approach, right? Poor synchronization, no step close, right? So again, these are the things that we're looking for. Right? Pretty easy to actually see once you know what to look for. And changing movement patterns can be very frustrating, right? We have to make sure that we are mindful of the mental state of the athlete, right? Encouraging, telling them that, hey, it takes a lot of reps. It takes time to make these changes happen, right? These movement patterns have been built over years and years. In order to change them, right, it takes a lot of time. So one of the more powerful tools that I've found that helps to facilitate learning is physical manipulation. So it gives an athlete, right, the sensation of what their limb is supposed to be doing, right? What their torso is supposed to be doing, right? So as you can see in this example, right, I'm putting his arm behind him, right? You can see that. I'm allowing him to feel what it feels like to have a stretch across his chest, what it feels like to have the internal rotators stretching and loading, right? I'm physically taking his torso, I'm rotating it, right? And notice, as I'm rotating his torso forward, I'm also forcing his arm into external rotation. You got to be very gentle here, right? But this allows them to feel, right, what it feels like to actually make a change, right? And this can lead to really, really fast and meaningful change, right? One of the most powerful tools you have. Visualization is another one. So all of the things that I've learned over the years that I've been trying to make changes in people's mechanics, right? We talk about visualization a lot. Talk about, let's go back a little bit. Sorry about that. So in this example, we talk about visualization because it helps, right? You have an athlete visualize what the proper movement is before they actually attempt the skill, right? And you do that with each rep. You give them visual cues that are close to what the movement pattern is like, right? Things that they may have done in their previous sport life. So with Erickson in this example here, sorry, the video is not playing, but he had gone through throwing. He had played baseball before. So what we did was I had him, hey, visualize yourself throwing, going through this throwing motion. And you end up actually, again, creating change. So for, again, all of you coaches, again, national team level, youth level, you have physical manipulation, you have visualization, and then you also have language, right? Language is a powerful tool. Certain words or phrases can assist with learning, right? Even for me, I was a national team volleyball player, and even I was swinging incorrectly. There was a term that was said to me that kind of opened up my brain to actually changing my mechanics, right? It had a lot to do with being loose and relaxed, right? So these are some of the words and phrases that I've found that are very, very helpful, right? And as a coach, right, this is where creativity is required, right? You have to think of ways in which, hey, how can I explain this in a way that my player will actually understand, right? So again, going through some of this language as you see here are some of the phrases that I've used to help facilitate some learning, okay? And then training at the youth level, right? A sec here, someone's mic is on. There we go. So training at the youth level, right? That's when real mechanics, right? Building a foundation of good mechanics really begins. So all of you youth coaches, right? You have a responsibility to help all of your young players understand mechanics. And this is where you actually can affect change. So some of the things that I've used over the course of training, right? Over these 7 years, right? Is training the overhead throwing motion as early as possible. So again, in America here, because we're a baseball heavy country, right? A lot of people learn how to throw at a young age, which puts us at an advantage. But you guys can start doing that, right? Throughout your training cycle, right? Learn how to actually go through the throwing motion, right? Use some of the cues that we talked about. And then also train the counter movement jump. Right? Now that we know that those two movements are part of the actual motion, we want to find ways in which to actually utilize them, right? And again, right, the earlier athletes start patterning these movements down, right? The earlier they get to actually get better at them, right? So again, in this example, all I'm doing is going through these motions even without a ball, right? This allows me to feel what it's like to actually activate certain muscles, to have my body opening up, right? So a lot of these things can be utilized by you. And again, this is where your coaching, right? The art of coaching comes in. You have to be creative. Think of things that actually mimic the movements that are being done, right? And the earlier you can do that, the more successful your players will be. Okay, and some final thoughts, right? We're almost done, promise. So again, rotation is king, right? Rotation, rotation, rotation. Have our kinetic chain. We know how to use force, properly sequence it throughout the body, hips, torso, arm, right? A little anatomy and physiology goes a long way. When you understand a few muscles, how they move, what they do, right? How they affect the movement, you can train the movement better. Know your reference points, right? So again, through this whole talk, we've looked at the sequence of the spike, right? What components, what segments of the body should be in certain positions, right? We know that we should film perpendicular to the athlete. That gives us the best chance of actually seeing all of this happening, right? Video is a very powerful tool. If you can get athletes to watch themselves, that's how you really affect change. They see that there's a problem happening, right? You can compare them to somebody that's doing it correctly, and you can affect change very quick. Train proper movement patterns early and often. So again, all of you youth coaches, start that overhead throwing motion now. Start that counter movement motion now. Creativity is welcome. Again, think of ways that you can get your players to feel these things. You can go through different kinds of movements. And again, you're free to imagine and explore, right? It's kind of a trial and error process. Again, what I've tried to do over these 7 years is just try to think of interesting ways, right? Interesting activities that people can do to actually affect change. And then this is the last part of it, right? Ultimate power, right, in the human body is a very fine balance between maximum effort and relaxation. So in all of these movements that we were looking at, right, we see that the torso is really the power source of the human body. Our limbs are kind of just relaxed, right? The motion that happens at our torso is radiated out to our arms, right? And so you have to strike a very, very fine balance between maximum effort and also relaxation. And that's it. So hopefully all of you again have learned a little something, right? And have some takeaways. And so now we get to open up the floor for some questions. I know I've been talking this whole time. I'm even tired of hearing myself talk. So I'll open up the floor to some questions. So please, here we go. All right.
I have a question.
Okay.
All the videos are shown that they are approaching to the net with the right steps. How do you say what is tension in the spine and the back when you approach to the net with the wrong foot, like a right-handed player with the right, left, right, and
yeah. So that would be considered a goofy-footed approach, right? So in a goofy-footed approach, and I want you to understand something. So there's even players at the highest levels in the world that actually have goofy-footed approaches. Now, the only thing that a goofy-footed approach would affect is usually a person's ability to actually change direction to a ball that's falling inside. And if you think about it, in a goofy-footed approach, the hips are actually already closed, right? When the player is taking off of the ground. That doesn't mean that they still can't rotate their torso open. However, when you're training, if you want to actually train proper mechanics, the way that you break down a goofy-footed approach is you start to have them just load on the opposite leg. So if I'm a right-handed player, my load leg is always my left leg, right? And so if they're loading on their right leg, that's something that you have to train. So usually what I've done in the past is I will have them just step closing. So they'll just be loaded. I'll either toss or set, and they have to explode off of that other leg. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. But is it possible to teach them right to do the steps?
It is. And like I said, that's a way in which to do it. Like I've broken a lot of goofy-footed approaches. It just takes time and repetition, but they have to have because they have a sense of loading, right? Of compressing on one side of their body. It's going to take them time to start doing it on the other side. So the first thing that I would do is I wouldn't even have them with a ball. I would just start having them loading on the opposite leg and just going through the motion of that step close, right? And the more and more they do that, basically what's happening is they're repatterning that motion. And the more and more they do it, right, the more and more the brain and the body connection starts to actually get fixed. So it is completely possible. It just takes time.
Thanks.
Great question. Really good question. Anyone else? Don't be afraid to ask.
How important is the internal and external shoulder roam?
Internal and
motion.
external, they're very, very important. So let's go back. That's a really good question. So internal and external rotation are vital, right, to the swing. If I can't properly externally rotate, I can't build enough energy in my internal rotators. So like in this example here, right? Let's go look at it here. So in this example, right? This is maximum external rotation. If you can't get to maximum external rotation, you'll never be able to hit hard enough, right? And so the arm will naturally internally rotate extremely fast if we can actually load the internal rotators during that motion. So a way in which to train internal and external rotation, again, is just actually going through a throwing motion, because internal and external rotation, that is the natural motion of your shoulder joint. So in order to hit with proper force, that really, really needs to be mastered. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but how often we should stretch those muscles who are responsible for those movements?
Well, stretching is somewhat important, right? You want to make sure that they have good range of motion, but the motion is more important. So when we were looking at some of the other examples of forcing the shoulder forward, so let's find that other example. Let me show you. See, okay, here we go. Whenever you see this occurring, right? This is improper internal external, right? Which is on the left side. So you see that he is not externally rotating here, right? See how that forearm is not behind his head and on that left side, on that left example. And on the right, that arm is way behind him, right? And that's one of the references that you have to be good at seeing. And so to your question of how much they should be actually either stretching or doing this motion, you want to try to have them doing it quite a bit so they can actually understand what the feeling, what the sensation of it is like. Because again, this has to be done rapidly during the actual swinging motion. Does that sort of answer your question, Janis?
Yes, but if there is not the motion is not that good to do the movements properly, there is not enough range of motion. We just need to go through the motions until our arm can swing that way.
Most of the time, at least in my experience of working with hundreds of different people that don't have great mechanics, or even like you're asking, don't externally rotate very well, is that they actually have no idea what it even feels like. And so with this guy, right, this person that I worked with, it took me actually going through this with him in order for him to even feel it. So the reason that, like right here, okay, so this position is one of the best ways for an athlete to actually feel what external rotation feels like, right? This is what they actually have a chance to feel a stretching motion. And so people that haven't ever really gone through the motion, they have no idea what the sensation is like. And so as a coach, your job is to kind of help facilitate what does that feel like And actually, when you have them actually feeling that sort of motion, like right now, I'm actually helping his arm, right, into external rotation. I'm rotating his torso forward. That's what it actually gave him the ability to feel it, right? And after he felt that, then he actually started to go through the motion. But again, to your question about how much, it depends on the person, right? And again, it may take hundreds of repetition to actually get them there, right? But again, that's part of the process of change. Is you kind of have to be a little creative. You have to do trial and error with different things to even kind of get a change to start to happen. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Jonas. That was a great question. Anybody else?
There is a question in the chat.
Is it at the bottom here? Is it a question about palm? Oh, okay. This is actually something I did not really talk about too much. So, palm contact or hand contact is really important, right? One of the things that is often incorrect is that we will tell our kids, hey, go flex your wrist, do this, right? But really the motion, if we're going through an arm swing motion, if you do it rapidly enough and you keep your hand relaxed, you go through extension and flexion actually really quickly. So in mechanics, the arm is often compared to a whip, right? And so the hand is the last part of that whip. And so you want to have your kids, the only real thing that I'll say is relax your hand. I don't want to see it stiff, and make sure you're just in the shape of the ball. Because when you contact, right, you want to make sure that you're actually in the shape of a sphere. Because if you're flat, that's actually a float serve, right? And you get no topspin. So topspin is created when you hit above the midpoint of a sphere, right? And hitting above a midpoint is usually caused by, right, a curved hand. And so I don't tell them too much. I just tell them to relax, right? And that usually will facilitate just rapid motion of the hand. Hopefully that helps. And that is a good question.
So basically, you should relax your whole limb.
Sorry, say that one more time.
You should relax your arm from the shoulder to the hand.
Exactly.
The ball. Okay.
Exactly. Like you really have to. So the swing, right, the spike is very counterintuitive, right? Because we're trying to hit something with a lot of force. So most people, including myself, before I even knew what was happening, I would tense up and I would try to basically use my shoulder to hit it, right? And when you're using your shoulder, you actually don't create a lot of stretch. You don't have any sort of loading. When you relax and you start to actually move your torso, you can see that as I'm moving, my arm kind of naturally goes through internal and external rotation by itself. But they have to be able to relax. Relaxing the shoulder is vital for velocity, right? The only thing that you have to be really aware of, because you can't just keep your arm dead, right? You have to control it, but you have to keep the shoulder joint relaxed so the arm can rotate. And you have to make sure your scapula is squeezed so that it's supported. Because if it's not supported, right, that can lead to kind of injury and it's not positioned properly. Any other questions?
Yes, I have question.
Okay.
So I'm studying sports science, and now I'm writing my biomehanic work about spike and beach volleyball. And our teacher told me that we can train or jump. So is it true or not?
That you wait. I'm sorry. Say that one more time. Your teacher told you that you can't do what?
That we can train or jump.
You
Is it
can't.
true or not? Yes.
You can't train or jump.
Yes, we can train jump.
You cannot train like jumping on the beach, you mean?
Yes.
That's kind of odd. I wonder why he would say that. Like you can't train like plyometrics on the beach, like in order to increase jumping ability.
Yes.
It's not going to be as beneficial as doing it on a harder floor, because when you're on sand, right? When you're on sand, that's a moving surface. And so you don't get, so in plyometrics, what you need is usually a hard surface. So you have an eccentric, an amortization phase, and then a concentric phase, right? Those are the three phases that you go through. Sand will usually break that down, but that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily train your jump. You're going to have to be approach and jumping on the beach regardless. However, if you're just focusing on jumping, I wouldn't recommend doing it on sand. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. And that was a good question. That was a tough one. Good question. Any others?
Good question.
Oh, maybe not.
I would like to ask about the scapula through the hit. You said it should be retracted isometrically. You should hold it, but you should hold it through the all the movement. Through the movement.
You're gonna hold it through external rotation. So let me go to the example again. You're gonna hold it while the arm is going through external rotation. Let's go to this example. All right. So right as it goes into external rotation, right, and then the elbow starts to move forward and the arm starts to actually come up towards the ball, that's when you can actually disengage, right? Because you have to actually let the arm accelerate forward. So during acceleration, that's when you allow the scapula to protract, right? Or go the opposite direction. So when you're doing external rotation, it has to be stabilized, right? And so when the arm finally is starting to accelerate forward, that's when the scapula actually protracts over the thorax. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thanks.
Good question. And that's a tough one. That's a tough one. Any other questions?
In chat.
Chat. Okay. Let me go back. Hold on a second. Okay, so if players are too small and can't jump to hit over the net, how do we practice hitting? Do we lower the net or do we practice hitting on the ground? That's a good question. So what my opinion of that is I think regardless of if they can jump or if they're small, you still have them hitting on whatever net that they're working on. So if they're kids, you're going to have them working on I don't know what it is in meters, maybe a 3-meter height net, because they have to understand actually how to position their bodies. So a kid that's smaller or that can't jump very high needs to understand that they have to contact underneath the volleyball. And that also will train them to get their feet closer to the ball during takeoff, right? So whenever you're training someone to do that, you don't tell them to stop hitting, right? All you do is you give them feedback, right? So if a kid is small, they have to actually get under the volleyball to hit, so they can actually strike it at an upward angle, right? If they're working just on mechanics and their arm's not very good, you can do that on the ground, right? And that's where you can actually facilitate a little bit of learning. But at some point, you have to have them trying to hit on a net. Does that make sense? Perfect. Good question. Any others?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
How much attention do you pay for ankles, dorsiflexion, range of motion?
I don't pay a ton of attention to it because I'm not like a physical therapist. I don't look too much into that. You would probably want to talk to like a movement specialist. And there's also ways in which to measure that. So if somebody like is lacking a lot of dorsiflexion, that obviously is going to impact their ability to get a little bit more tension out of their muscles. But again, that would be a little bit more related to like a functional movement specialist versus kind of what I do. But that is really important. I wish I could give you a better answer, but it is important because if you can't get enough stretch at the ankle, knee, or the hip, all three joints, you're not going to have as much upward force. But again, I usually I don't do those type of assessments. That's usually someone else, and then they will tell me, hey, this is the range of motion that they have at these particular joints. Hopefully that answers your question. I know it doesn't answer it very well.
Yeah, thanks anyway.
Of course, thanks for the question. Anybody else? Again, if not, that's totally cool.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then thank you very much, Isaac. It was very interesting.
My pleasure.
So yes, for everyone else, I would like to say that we will take a 10-minute break and move on to the next lecture. But I just want to say that the next lecture will be not on this Zoom meeting, but there will be a separate link, which is in the email that we sent yesterday. So, okay, thank you, and have a great night, Isaac, and see you after
everyone.
the break. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.